Okay. We have a few new folks here with Doug, so welcome. Just in time as we get to the nuts and bolts of hazelnuts. So the title for our session this evening is going to be Hazelnut Primer, the good, the bad, and the ugly, meaning we're going to want to discuss what hazelnuts are, why we're excited about hazelnuts as a viable perennial crop in Iowa and throughout the Midwest, what the challenges are, and then finally, what issues still need to be worked through? And I'm going to be sharing some great resources for further reading, research, and investigation at the end. There will be a quiz, so pay attention. And so let's get into it. Here are the goals and objectives of this second session. So by the end of the presentation this evening, you should know the 3 different species of hazelnuts and some defining characteristics, why we're working with these quote unquote hybrid hazelnuts, certainly the opportunities and challenges associated with growing hazelnuts, some pest and disease issues that are impacting hybrid hazelnut production, really understand pollination and plant physiology. And then finally, what makes native and hybrid hazelnuts special? So let's do some learning, jump right in. What are hazelnuts? Are they filberts? Well, yes. Do they grow on trees or shrubs? Well, both, actually, depending on where and what you're growing. So will they grow in Iowa? Yes, maybe. So are they the great big smooth shelled nuts in bags of raw in-shell nuts you'd find in the grocery store? Well, the answer to that one's not quite. Okay, I'll stop. I know the suspense is killing you, so let me get on to it. Hazelnuts are in the birch family, and there's 3 main species, the beaked, the European, and American. And each has its own characteristics. All 3 are monoecious, meaning they have male and female flowers on the same plant. So looking at the beaked hazelnut, this is Corlus cornuta. It grows as a shrub or a small tree. It has a very distinctive husk, giving it the name beaked because of that elongated husk, which really resembles a beak. And so the native range of the beaked hazelnut, it's quite extensive, from parts of the South all the way through the eastern seaboard north to Maine, all the Canadian provinces, across the upper Midwest, and then into the mountain states and even California. So that long husk, or involucre we call it, it completely surrounds the nut inside. And the nut is really small with a thick shell, and it has a relatively high level of resistance to eastern filbert blight. Eastern filbert blight. Now, that's the main disease affecting hazelnut production. And we're going to take a little bit more in-depth look at that later in the presentation. But as a native plant with few commercial uses because of the small nut, it doesn't really, it contributes some, I guess. It contributes some of the EFB resistance to the quote unquote hybrid hazelnuts, but commercially, just not really viable because of those small, tiny nuts. So let's shift gears to the American hazelnuts. That's Corlus americana. Now, this is the species we're most likely to encounter in Iowa, and in fact, throughout much of the upper Midwest. I've heard from many older, wiser members of the Iowa Nut Growers Association that they have very fond memories of picking wild hazelnuts on the fringe of the forest or even in the ditches and fence lines. Although today, I got to say, there are fewer areas where wild hazelnuts grow, certainly compared to years past. So the native range, this is the map here of the American hazelnut, and you can you can see that it includes almost all of the South except Florida, and all of the eastern USA, and then the 3 eastern provinces, Canada, and then extending west to the Rocky Mountains there. So a pretty extensive range for the American hazelnut. Now, the American hazelnut's going to differ from the beaked hazelnut in a couple of ways, most notably by having a moderate husk that surrounds the nuts in the cluster, but it's certainly not as long as the beaked hazelnut, not as distinct. So it's going to be that multi-stem shrub, small, thick shells, though, little commercial value on their own. So when we say small nuts, we're looking at, well, I should say, with thick shells, European hazelnuts are going to be roughly 50-50. All right. They're going to be relatively thin shelled, 50-50 kernel, 50-50 shell. So we're looking at hazelnuts that are going to be roughly 30, maybe 33% kernel and mostly shell. And what we want to try to get to, obviously, is ramp that percent kernel up to get closer to that 50% mark. And we do that by getting thinner and thinner shells, and then, of course, hybridizing with the Europeans. But we'll get to that. So next up is the European hazelnut. Now, this is Corlus avellana, and really the workhorse of hazelnut production in the United States, led by efforts at Oregon State University. And they are the leaders in breeding, production, outreach to growers. Basically, the industry in Oregon and the Pacific Northwest is mature and robust because of Oregon State University. So European hazelnut production is really clustered, though, as you can see on this map, in the Willamette Valley of Oregon and Washington. This is a really interesting place because they can grow over a dozen different crops here, from huckleberries to turf grass to alfalfa to hazelnuts to other fruits. Just a really interesting place. And then keep in mind the Pacific Northwest is a very temperate, almost subtropical, not subtropical, but very temperate. And it does have moderate temperatures, temperate temperatures, not like what we have here. So moving on to some of the defining characteristics of the European hazelnut, and then the production system that they're grown in. So right off the bat, like I mentioned, is the large size, thin shells, where the shell to kernel ratio is about 50-50. And we're looking at roughly 25 to maybe 33% in our native American hazelnuts. And then, of course, with the hybrids, trying to get up there in that 40-45% range in some cases. When we look at the nut clusters, the husk doesn't even cover the nut. That's another obvious characteristic of the European, is the fact that that husk doesn't even go all the way around that nut. And then, of course, they're grown typically as single-stemmed trees with very little vegetation growing between the rows. And then finally is they're not terribly cold hardy, and then they're susceptible to EFB. And again, I'm going to skip over the EFB just for now. We're going to talk more about it in the pest and disease section. But on the cold hardy front, here's what I understand the problem is in talking with other growers in the Midwest who have just tried to say, I want to do cultivars from Oregon. So we're going to bring those Oregon cultivars out to the Midwest. And the assumption is they're either going to die due to the cold temperatures, because remember, Oregon is kind of, in Washington, they have rainforests, so they have a much more temperate climate, or the male catkins are going to freeze off. And we'll get to the male catkins and the female flowers shortly. So, of course, if the male catkins freeze off, then there won't be enough pollen to facilitate complete pollination. Now, one thing I know is that Nebraska is experimenting with planting some of these cultivars and then planting the native Midwestern hazelnuts as the pollinators to ensure adequate pollination. The jury's still out, and hopefully one day we'll get some information from Aaron Clare and his group there at Nebraska. Maybe we'll get an update at the next Hazelnut Growers Conference. But in a nutshell, the puns never end. In a nutshell, that's the European hazelnut, Corlus avellana. Okay, so where do hazelnuts, these hybrid, I should say, hazelnuts, fit into the hazelnut picture? Well, interestingly enough, hybrid hazelnuts combine the best of all three species. We get a cold hardy shrub or bush, that's the form we're talking about, with larger nut size, thinner shells. They're actually worth harvesting and processing, while also getting an improved pellicle. The pellicle is basically just the skin that's around the kernel. That's just pellicle is a fancy word for skin. Now, some kernels are going to have I guess you could describe it as a sort of thick woolly skin that when you eat it can sometimes get stuck to your tongue. And then some kernels won't have much of a skin at all. But there's a lot of diversity within these hybrids as it relates to skin on the kernel. Now, incidentally, in Oregon, nuts are actually bred for a very thin skin that can easily rub off once it's either roasted or blanched. So that's one of the criteria that they're actually trying to breed for. Um, Resistance, or it's really more appropriately tolerance to EFB, Eastern Filbert Blight, is the real game changer that Midwestern hazelnuts have to offer. So this documented resistance or tolerance, again, to EFB has been confirmed by Oregon State University and the partners at the what we call the Hazelnut Consortium. And that's Rutgers University, the University of Nebraska, Arbor Day Foundation, and then Oregon State University. And now keep in mind that EFB, Eastern Filbert Blight, that's not the same everywhere in the US. And well, I'll probably get in trouble for saying this because I'm not sure if it's entirely true, but I like to think of EFB as having sort of flavors. That is to say, EFB in New Jersey is not the same as EFB that's in the Midwest. And it's in the Midwest here different than what EFB is in Oregon. And so this is yet another reason why trying to simply export that Oregon production model here to the Midwest, it's really going to be a challenge and maybe probably not going to work. So sometimes it's the cultivars that have been bred to be resistant to EFB in Oregon. They come out here to the Midwest and they end up being susceptible to the EFB that we have here. So, yeah. Oh, hi, Clayton. Okay. So these Midwest and by extension hybrid hazelnuts do have a novel resistance that is different than the simple gas away gene that has been bred into the resistance to the Oregon cultivars. So in a nutshell, that's what hybrid hazelnuts are compared then to the beaked or the European hazelnuts, to kind of get a sense for the different types of hazelnuts that are out there and what other growers in other parts of the world might be growing. Okay. So now what's wrong with thing here? Okay. No, come on now. There we go. I'm going to take just a second to wet my whistle here. I've been talking long enough. If anybody's got any questions, pipe up. Okay.
Now I know why those Oregon hazelnut trees that I bought will probably die in Iowa.
Never know. Never know.
Never
So
know.
we got to test it out for sure. So let's talk about plant growth, structure, pollination, so on and so forth. Okay, so hybrid hazelnuts, we're looking at multi-stemmed shrubs. They could range in size from maybe 6 to 8 feet tall, all the way up to 12 or 14 feet in height, and then anywhere from 4 to 8 feet in diameter. Now, in this picture here, we're looking at a large shrub that's maybe 10 foot tall, and notice that it kind of has this, what I would call a really dense upright form. That is to say, you can actually see the bottom of the shrub, and it doesn't have these large branches that kind of droop over and touch the ground. And then you can also see that the crown of the plant is relatively tight. It doesn't have a lot of suckers that are coming out and really suckering out, which is a little bit different than some other shrubs. Now, contrast that with this shrub here, which I might maybe consider as having a wide kind of splayed form with a larger diameter and branches that sort of hang over, especially when they're heavy laden with nut clusters. But even without the weight of the clusters, these shrubs tend to have just this wide splayed form that I kind of call it. And so you might be asking yourself, well, why does it even matter, right? And ultimately, you may be right. But that is something I tend to keep track of with the plants that interest me for propagating, so that dense upright form or shrub, it's going to tend to fit better in the harvesting equipment that might be used to one day facilitate mechanical harvesting. So time will tell, but machine harvestability is one of those characteristics that I think we might need to keep in mind as we continue to search for improved cultivars. Um, so pollination, I want to shift gears to pollination real quick because I think that's pretty important to just understand as an overall concept. So here we have some pictures of the elongated male catkins that are actually spreading and shedding their pollen in the wind. Hazelnuts are wind pollinated. The catkins produce this kind of cloud of pollen that will hopefully find its way to a receptive female flower. Now, keep in mind that male catkins will start growing in the spring. Then they're going to stay on the shrub throughout harvest, over the winter. They're out there right now, and then finally start shedding pollen in March and April before eventually falling off. So because of this, some growers have reported issues with a lack of pollination, which they attribute to maybe a lack of male catkins. And I myself, I've witnessed heavy snow drifts where the snow will drift up and then into the rows of hazelnuts. And then I've seen hungry pheasants walk right up the snowdrift to the tops of the hazelnut shrub and start eating those male catkins that are hanging there. So some food for thought. Another pun that landed poorly. But anyway, I don't have a live audience. Moving on to the female flower. Ah, yes, here we go. Here's the female flower when it finally emerges and blooms on the shrub. Now it's not very showy. I'll zoom in a little bit there. I mean, don't get me wrong, that bright red fuchsia color is really unbelievable, but it's so small and tiny. It's not very showy. But anyways, once you do see them and you take the time to look at them in the hazelnuts when you're out there in the spring, it's really amazing. I think that this picture really kind of helps to understand the challenges with breeding better hazelnuts. So imagine a thought exercise for a moment. Imagine this shrub out in the orchard during pollination, and each one of those tiny hairs could be a nut if the pollen makes it all the way to the base of the pistillate, where reproduction occurs, and then that nut can grow. But notice how many of those hairs are present. And then in the pollen cloud consisting of many different plants, it's not inconceivable that when it comes time to harvest that nut cluster of, let's say, 5 nuts, every one of those nuts could have a different father. So think of it this way, using this nut cluster here as an example, this cluster has 6 individual nuts in the cluster. And so we may know 1/2 of the genetic makeup from the mother plant, but unless you control the pollen cloud, the father side of the genetic mix can vary wildly in a population because each nut could have been pollinated by a different father. And so this is actually why when you're making controlled crosses, they make little pressure tents that are built around the shrub to keep outside pollen out. And then the desired pollen is basically, to explain it, is painted with a little paintbrush on the female flower with this brush. That's what hand pollination is. You hand pollinate that mother plant with the desired pollen that you've collected, and then you can have a controlled cross. So I find that fascinating. It's pretty cool to see those little tents that they build to be able to do some of those crosses so that they're negative pressure, so that it's always going out and you never have pollen coming in. So that's going to wrap up the short section on growth, form, structure, and pollination. Now we're going to get to the good. So the title of this session is Hazelnut Primer, the Good, the Bad, the Ugly. And so we're going to set the stage and begin with the good. And so the good news is that American hazelnuts are native to the Midwest and many other parts of North America. And then by extension, hybrid hazelnuts should do well in those areas as well. So in the same places where Corlys americana grows well, these hybrid hazelnuts should grow well in addition. One of the biggest reasons that I'm interested in hazelnuts is because it's a perennial crop, and it has huge, capital HUGE potential, not only environmentally, because it represents roots in the ground all year long, but also commercially as a specialty crop. We're not there yet. I just want to be really upfront about that. But we are making progress with a good plan and results to show for the planning that has taken place so far. So this map is going to show the native range of the American hazelnuts, which would be then a surrogate for where the hybrid hazelnuts could potentially be grown. And something to consider is that not all hybrid hazelnuts are the same. Depending on lineage and the percent of the European versus American genetics in the mix, there really is some variability. So it's really the case that some eventual cultivars might need to be selected for the state or geographic region that best suits that plant. And that's one of the really cool things about the work that's going now with these joint performance trials and these hazelnut test plots, is so that we can find out how one particular experimental genotype does from northern Wisconsin and northern Minnesota all the way down through northern Iowa, southern Minnesota, and into Illinois. So we talk about the potential, and the potential of hazelnuts is what really gets me excited. The basics: hazelnuts are a heart healthy snack that's roughly 50% oil by weight. And I want to say that again. The kernels are roughly 50% oil by weight. And hazelnut oil is what's called monounsaturated. Monounsaturated. And that's the healthiest of all the oils. And it's almost identical to olive oil. In fact, and I love telling this story, according to an article that I read, the Europeans had to develop a DNA test to differentiate between hazelnut oil and olive oil, because some shady actors would cut olive oil with hazelnut oil. And since they're so similar, and because olive oil commands a premium in the marketplace, no one would be the wiser. Or I've also heard of stories of tanker loads of hazelnut oil being shipped to the large port at Rotterdam and then essentially relabeled as olive oil to be sold to unsuspecting customers. So I think that's really cool that hazelnuts are monounsaturated and almost identical to olive oil, because it is our healthiest cooking oil and baking and stuff like that. So any which way you cut it, yet another pun that didn't quite hit the mark. Any which way you cut it, hazelnuts are a great choice for baking, salad dressings, covered in chocolate, or simply roasted and tossed into salads, cookies. The possibilities are endless. On the value added front, although really decades away, hazelnut oil has all sorts of uses for industrial applications, and even could be used as a biodiesel feedstock if times ever got real tough. So all sorts of really cool opportunities in the food industry, as well as industrial applications for hazelnut oil. So I mentioned earlier that we are making progress with some results to show. And perhaps the biggest accomplishment to date is being the recipient of a USDA specialty crops research grant. We call them SCREE grants. And this has funded much of the work being done at the University of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and with some of our partners. And this is a multi-million-dollar grant that has many research and outreach components, from breeding to micropropagation to flavor analysis, pest and disease issues, harvesting, processing, outreach to growers, all sorts of different things. And then there's also dedicated research going on at the University of Minnesota through the Forever Green initiative. And that's focused on perennial crops. And so a lot of great work being done at the Center for Crops Utilization. Excuse me. And then joint performance trials that have been set up across the Midwest and even into Canada to test the performance of these plants over time, so that eventually we can make recommendations to growers for what to grow and where. And then finally, we've really seen some harvesting and processing improvements made over the years to reduce the hand labor and time involved harvesting, processing, so that we can get to that kernel for just outright roasting and sales or other value-added products. So all sorts of great progress made there. And you can learn more about some of that progress at the upcoming Upper Midwest Hazelnut Growers Conference that's going to be hosted by the Iowa Nut Growers Association on Friday, March 3rd and Saturday, March 4th up in beautiful Decorah, Iowa at the Hotel Winneshiek. Okay, we talked about the good. Now it's time to talk about the bad, or some of the challenges we face trying to develop hybrid hazelnuts as a viable perennial crop in the Midwest. Well, the first one, and perhaps the top question I get asked when talking to new growers is, what do I plant? And this is a huge obstacle. So simply stated, and I just want to be very blunt about this, that there will not be a hazelnut industry in the Midwest without better plants. Period. In my opinion, it is the single greatest obstacle or challenge that we face to actually achieving profitability. And more on profitability later, but that needs to be heard. It needs to be repeated. It just needs to be understood. Another factor that significantly impacts profitability is the lack of mechanization, both in the planting and harvesting aspects of production. And we really need to drive down labor costs, and mechanization can help. Propagation. So this is another bad challenge that we're faced with. And once we identify some of these promising genotypes that are being grown in these hazelnut test plots, we need to ramp up plants from dozens or hundreds to tens of thousands of plants or more in a relatively short time frame. And mound layering is a cheap and effective, but unfortunately not very productive way with limited numbers of plants that can be produced using that technique. Micropropagation is a method that generates hundreds of thousands of seedlings, but we really have some challenges with the ability to successfully micropropagate some of these experimental genotypes. So this is another bottleneck that really needs to get figured out. Again, some incremental progress has been made. I know recently there's been some alternatives that have been looked at with some seed grafting. In fact, that's going to be one of the presentations at the upcoming Upper Midwest Hazelnut Growers Conference, March 4th in Decorah, Iowa. Jason Fishbach and Mark Hammond with the University of Minnesota will be talking specifically about that technique. So wanted to put that plug in there. Finally, competition. So, the Midwest is not the only area in the world where hazelnuts can be grown. And the big boys like Ferrero Rocher, who make those lovely candies and make Nutella, they are aggressively searching out new regions and growers all throughout the world. So that's something that we can't overlook. We really look at hazelnuts, or I certainly look at hazelnuts as being one of many different agroforestry crops that could potentially be grown. And I look at more of it from the lens of a specialty crop that can help us get roots in the ground all year long and help us to actually address and solve some of our water quality issues because of the bare soil that we have with the annual row crop production system. Okay, so this is a topic that lots and lots of folks are curious about and want to know more about what to grow. And so the bottom line is that at present, there are few options that exist for proven cultivars. So you have Grand Traverse and the Beast. These are two selections that the University of Nebraska has been working with and growing, and they are available to growers right now through Great Plains Nursery in Nebraska. Then there's going to be some selections from Grimo Nut Nursery in Ontario, Canada, and that's Ernie and Linda Grimo, father-daughter team. and they have some selections that they've been growing and providing to growers to test out, but certainly limited amounts of plants exist. In fact, I was talking just to Linda today, and I think she's going to be able to join us for the Hazelnut Growers Conference. I'll stop. I won't do another plug, but it sounds like she will be able to make it in person from Canada. Several of the selections from Grimo are actually in these joint performance trials, or these hazelnut test plots, I guess you could say. And so that's some really good news. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, well, if there really aren't any cultivars that exist, then what are all of these other growers that are out there planting? And, what are they? There's growers out there with hazelnuts already. What did they grow? And the answer to that one is simply, those are open pollinated seedlings that were made available through a number of nurseries. Phil Rudder, Tom Wall, other agroforesters, I guess you could say, in the Midwest here. There's actually some nurseries that you can find on the midwesthazelnuts.org website. That's another great resource. That's at the end of the talk here, but that has a listing of some different nurseries that are here in the Midwest, but even some, I think Nutty Z's out in New York is on that one, as well as North American Plants too. But anyways, research is underway with these hazelnut test plots, like I said, and these on-farm a network of collaborating growers that are testing these experimental genotypes that could eventually, we hope, become cultivars. And so that's kind of the end game for a lot of these joint performance trials, is that we hope that some of these selections that have been selected for any number of reasons, from growers to researchers, and it might be the overall yield, it might be the nut characteristics from thin shells to precocious, whatever the case may be. And so the hope is that and I think we're up to maybe 25 or 30 of these experimental genotypes at this point, that hopefully out of this something, 2, 3, 4 will be promising enough to be able to be released to growers, that they can have some semblance of information to know what they're getting into by growing them. Like I mentioned, I think we're presently up to roughly 30 experimental genotypes that are being tested in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, Canada. And an experimental genotype is a promising shrub that, for whatever reason, someone selected, and it could eventually become a cultivar. That's the whole point. So I sometimes think of it as the minor leagues, right? So if a shrub ends up standing out, it could potentially become a named cultivar with a trip to the big leagues and the seat at the table. But anyways, you can see this spreadsheet here. We have experimental genotypes from growers from Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa. So Aldara, Frank, Beast, Grand Traverse, Rose 9-2, ARB 7-1, Heasby. These are just a few of the many shrubs that we're evaluating, again, from northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, all the way down through southern Iowa. Our furthest southern site in Iowa is Centerville, Iowa, Indian Hills Community College, and that's only about 15 or 20 miles from the Missouri border. Excuse me. Well, mechanization is needed in virtually all aspects of production, but especially with harvesting. And we'll talk a little bit more about harvesting and mechanization in actually a later Hazelnut Academy session. So I'm not going to dwell on it too much here, but suffice to say, it is a challenge. Improved cultivars, or simply better plants, I said is a bottleneck. We need better plants. And so propagation is one of those additional bottlenecks, because once we find a good plant, we need to be able to expand and really get those plants out there relatively quickly. And so the challenges of mound layering I touched on earlier. Yes, it is cheap because you can do it on farm. It's effective, but on a year-over-year basis, one mother plant can produce maybe 8 to 10 clones, maybe. So scale up is going to be difficult, not impossible. Keep in mind that Grimo Nut Nursery, they use stool bed layering to produce a lot of the seedlings that they do, but certainly not on the size and scale that we're looking for to be able to get, hundreds or even thousands of acres out on the landscape. The preferred method of getting large numbers of plants is tissue culture or micropropagation, which can produce these large numbers of plants because they're grown in a petri dish. As you can see on the kind of the left-hand side there, that's jars growing in a medium, these cuttings, and then you can transfer them to a growing medium that's just right. And then they'll grow, and you can get them to grow as individual plants. And so this process of being able to take these plants from a cutting of a known plant to then growing their own roots and being their own seedling is a really major focus area of this specialty crops research grant that I mentioned. And we're hoping that there's going to be some advances just right around the corner to allow us for some of these to be able to scale up. You know, as interested as we all are in growing hazelnuts, we're not alone. So the Oregon model of production and the European model, I guess you could say, the Oregon model of production that's been developed by Oregon State, it's being exported to other areas of the globe that have that same climate and where hazelnuts have probably not been traditionally grown. So think of South America and Chile and Argentina specifically. So we're seeing large increases in plants going in the ground, and then the number of hectares, again, they're in the metric system, being dedicated to hazelnuts. But even closer to home, the folks in Ontario, Canada, have been hard at work developing an industry up there based on the Oregon model to feed a large processing facility. I think it's Brant, Ontario, that at one time produced all of the Nutella for North American markets. And so that's pretty interesting in my mind, that one plant produces all the Nutella out there. And so they're looking for other sources of nuts besides the spect Tonda de Grifoni that they have right now. Okay, so to wrap up, we're going to continue with some challenges, but these are the ones that I call ugly. This is the ugly portion of the presentation, because these are some issues that can be kind of messy. And the first is pest and disease issues, which honestly we don't know much about. We're learning about more and more every day, every season. And honestly, they might not even be present because of such low numbers of plants that are on the landscape. However, with eventual expansion, with better plants, how will these plants stand up to increasing pest issues? So we know that eastern filbert blight is a major concern, but at the same time, our plants seem to have some level of protection because they're either tolerant or resistant to EFB. But I think what's less well known is what else do we need to be worried about? So big bud mite. I think that's something that maybe should be on the horizon for folks. Japanese beetles, definitely. The brown marmorated stink bug. I think that's possibly going to be one to look out for too, but maybe it's a little bit too soon to tell. And then what about the filbert moth? For instance, I think that they might even be on my farm. But the point is we need more research, and we need to be prepared to learn with the researchers in tandem that are identifying these pests and disease issues so that we can stay ahead of the game, I guess, as it might be said. So here's what big bud mite and EFB look like. Big bud mite manifests itself as swollen and exploded buds. And then EFB presents itself as these two parallel rows of black pustules. It's kind of difficult to see on that stem at the bottom there, but that's what EFB looks like. It's fairly distinct if you do see it. That's the big bud mite life cycle. And I'm not going to dwell too much on big bud mite because I don't know a lot about it. I think maybe I've seen it, but I don't know for sure. Last year at the Hazelnut Growers Conference in Wisconsin, we had an absolutely fantastic presentation about pest and disease issues from Haley Shonovich from the University of Minnesota. And she encouraged all of us to go home after the conference and go check your plants and see if you have any exploded buds. And I looked and I looked and I really couldn't tell. I was unsure of myself. But this year, they've actually put together a insect and pest guide for hybrid hazelnuts. And so that is an awesome book that you can find on the Upper Midwest or the hybridhazelnut.org website. And I've got it's in the resource section here later on in the presentation. So, okay, we have to talk about Japanese beetles. Japanese beetles are something that I have only found one single Japanese beetle on my planting here in north central Iowa. However, at the Del Lawrence hazelnut test plot, that would be down by Cedar Rapids, Iowa, he has had some plants devastated. We've also had plants down at our southern site at Indian Hills Community College. So Japanese beetles are around. And so as you can see, they're going to defoliate the plant and rob the plant of surface leaf area. That's going to rob the plant of the nutrients it needs through photosynthesis. So, and that's what they look like. And they are just all over the plant. And that is the result of what they do is they skeletize then that plant, and it just weakens the plant because it doesn't have an opportunity to grow and produce the food that it needs through photosynthesis. You can see how it curls up there. So Japanese beetles, a scourge. I haven't experienced them yet, but I'm waiting because I know they're going to be here before I know it. Okay. Well, I wanted to show this picture because this was interesting. Um, when we're harvesting hazelnuts here on the farm, we take what we call test bags, and it's just a way for me to take a bucket that someone harvests, and I put it in a bag so that I can come back and shell it out and see how many pounds of in-shell nuts are in that bag. We pay pickers $5 per bucket, so on a volume basis. And so I want to be sure that the poundage is commensurate with the volume. And so these test bags are just onion sacks, and I'll put them into the drying bin. And I did that this year and came back in and I lifted the sacks up, and lo and behold, I've got worms. And so I still don't know what they are. I've got to get this picture to Haley at the University of Minnesota or somebody at the entomology lab at ISU. I think it might be the filbert moth, but I'm not entirely sure. But I was just amazed at how many of them there are. So I happen to have the camera there with my, that's what's cool with phones nowadays. They all have cameras, so you can get a couple of nice, good pictures there. So. Well, let's talk just briefly about profitability. Profitability is an ugly challenge that we need to address. And I feel that we really need to demonstrate before we can really see expansion of any sort of an industry here in the Midwest. Improved profitability can come through many avenues, though. I want to be clear about that. It can be better plants. It can be just overall reduced establishment costs, reduced labor, innovative multi-cropping systems. I think we need to think about that can provide some income in the early years while the shrubs are growing but not producing. And I want to point out this Landowner's Guide to Perennial Crop Options, which is a nice document I put together several years ago, and actually in the process of updating it. And so it provides some really useful information. Specifically, it has an enterprise worksheet in it, and then a 20-year financial model that growers can use. In fact, I wanted to introduce this to you tonight because we're going to be using this kind of enterprise budget and framework in our upcoming sessions as we talk through the planning process and then the need to start putting pen to paper to sketch out what the risks and rewards might be for the decisions that you might want to make in terms of types of plants, production system, spacing, layout, all of those things. And so this document is actually available on the Trees Forever website, where you can do a simple search for Landowner's Guide to Perennial Crop Options. And again, we're going to be using this as our framework going forward. And then I'm also updating it here for this year. So look for an updated version sometime later this spring. So finally, it's not something I'm going to dwell upon a whole lot, but something I think it's worthy of bringing up as a challenge, and an ugly challenge is the eventual need to look into financing the establishment of a planting. And establishment costs can vary significantly depending on a range of factors. However, the one constant is going to be that you're not going to have any production and thus income for at least 2 years and perhaps up to 4 or 5 years. And so that means that innovative financing is going to be needed to provide that upfront capital to invest in plantings, in addition to trying to figure out how you can bring in some annual income doing something between the rows where the hazelnuts aren't growing. And so this is actually where validating production figures, harvest estimates, some of that stuff can really help almost build a library of figures from growers all around the Midwest so that lenders can have confidence in the assumptions made developing these enterprise budgets or the feasibility studies that'll come along with them. And so the banker is going to know that they can get their money back. I think that's a really important component of the Iowa Hazelnut Project, and something that I'm working with landowners to try to sketch out and keep track of is what some of those costs are, and then what some of those timelines are before production, and then what some of those yields are for some plants or some of those cultivars. Okay, well, I want to wrap up with some resources for further reading. That's a little bit smaller than I wanted, but that's okay. Okay. So these are some resources. I mentioned the Landowner's Guide to Perennial Crop Options, the Upper Midwest Hazelnut Development Initiative, midwesthazelnuts.org, the Hazelnut Consortium. This is that group of University of Nebraska, Arbor Day Foundation, Oregon State University, Rutgers University, and then I believe the University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry has joined the fray as well. So another group doing a lot of great work as it pertains to hazelnuts. I wanted to mention that insect management guide for hybrid hazelnuts. That is a fantastic document that has a lot of great information that growers should have and print off and keep it as a part of their toolbox. A nice reference document. And that can be found at that midwesthazelnuts.org website, or in this case, the Forever Green at the University of Minnesota. The Iowa Nut Growers YouTube page, all sorts of great videos that has information on harvesting, establishment, some of the pest and disease issues, how to cage your plants from deer, so on and so forth. We also have the Iowa Hazelnut Project on Facebook. And so you can check that out and like, share, and subscribe, the whole 9 yards, so you can stay up to date on videos and information we post there. And then, of course, we have an Iowa Nut Growers Association website with all sorts of great stuff, not hazelnut specific, but information on black walnuts, pecans, hickories, heart nuts, you name it. Our next session is going to be Friday, February 3rd, 6 p.m., 1 week from today. Be there or be square. That will be session 3, Planning the Best Laid Plans of Mice and Men. One of my favorite sessions, because I think it's so crucial. You can learn so much from others, growers that have come before you, so that you can not make the same mistakes that others have made and save yourself some time and money along the way. And with that, it's quiz time. Quiz time. Let's see here. Oh, great. We have some questions here too. We'll get to that in just a second. So the first quiz question we want to know, and I'm actually going to pop my camera on. The first quiz question is going to be, drum roll, please. Oh, holy moly. Name the 3 species, or name one of the 3 species of hazelnuts grown in the United States. Anybody have any guesses? You can either chat them or unmute your mic and just blurt one out. maybe think back to some of the maps that I showed and some of those ranges of some of those different species. Anybody remember what one of those three species might be? Excellent, correct. Beaked hazelnut. Beaked hazelnut's going to be one of those species. Of course, the American hazelnut, which would be the native to the Midwest here, and then the European hazelnut. Um, uh, And so those three are going to be the three species that are primarily grown in the USA here. And then, of course, the hybrid hazelnuts would be the American hazelnuts combined with the European hazelnut to get that thinner shell and larger nut size. All right, good job. Let's name one pest or disease concern with hazelnuts. EFB, the survey says, and that would be correct. Also acceptable would have been big bud mite or filbert moth or brown marmorated stink bug or Japanese beetle. You could even say maybe deer or squirrels or blue jays. Okay, next quiz question. What oil is hazelnut oil almost identical to? What oil is hazelnut oil almost identical to? And we've had some guesses. And olive oil. Yes, very good. Olive oil wasn't only Popeye's girlfriend, but it's also the oil that hazelnuts is almost identical to. Monounsaturated. Monounsaturated. That's the fatty acid profile of hazelnut oil and of olive oil. Okay, great. Now name two existing cultivars that are available to growers. Name two existing cultivars that are available to growers that I would have named or would have been on the screen during part of the presentation that are actually available to growers today. And there's certainly some of those European varieties and cultivars from out in Oregon, Jefferson, Barcelona, Yamhill. There's all sorts of different ones, but we're thinking of what two cultivars in the mid. Yes, the Beast. Excellent. The Beast would be one of those, and then Grand Traverse would be another one. Those are going to be two existing cultivars available to growers. Great Plains Nursery in Nebraska, amongst others, are going to have those two cultivars. And then, of course, some of the cultivars that Grimo Nut Nursery has. So Frank and Aldara and Andrew and Northern Blaze and Marion and some of those. Okay. So we talked about two cultivars. So they're actually named cultivars. Now name two experimental genotypes that are being evaluated. And remember, the genotypes they're not quite there yet. We can't quite call them cultivars. They're still being tested to see how they do from Minnesota and Wisconsin and Iowa and some other places. So name two experimental genotypes that maybe are being evaluated. Yes, very good. Heasby, ARB 7-1, Rose 9-2. Excellent, excellent. Those are a couple of those experimental genotypes that we have at some of these plantings spread throughout Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Well, gang, that's going to wrap things up here. I want to make one final plug for the Save the Date, the Upper Midwest Hazelnut Growers Conference. That's going to be on Friday, March 3rd and Saturday, March 4th. Friday, March 3rd, we're going to have a processing open house and a show and tell session in the evening. If you'd like to talk a little bit about your farm, or if if you're doing some processing, or have a topic that you would like to share, maybe you're just getting started, with growing nuts or something like that, contact me and you'll get a little 10-second slot and you can share with the group whatever you'd like. And then on Saturday is going to be the big day. We'll be starting at 8:30 with presentations from genetics, talking about different grafting techniques, where you can get some plants. We're going to have information on pest and disease issues, a growers panel, the award for the Hazelnut Grower of the Year. It's going to be a blast and a lot of fun in Decorah, Iowa. Okay, let's jump into questions that folks might have. And let me jump into the chat because I think, Clayton, you had a couple here. Let's see here. Focusing on root formation, fantastic. Deep wood mulch, excellent. Corlus americana, awesome. Yep. Oh, and you've had the Japanese beetles, so you know what they're all about. And this year I put traps far away from my fruit trees, so the beetles are attracted to the traps and not toward my fruit trees. Smart. Now, Don Lewis, entomologist with Iowa State, has some interesting things to say about Japanese beetle traps. But oh, chickens, yes, to control hive beetles and Japanese beetles. Interesting. So a good friend of mine, Roy Serling, him and I went in together and purchased a hazelnut husker. He used to grow near Wyckoff, Minnesota, and he actually raised turkeys and I think some chickens as well in the hazelnuts. And so that's interesting. And then, of course, Reginaldo, he has the chicken production model that kind of features hazelnuts as one of the woody crops where the chickens can free range and stuff like that. And so interesting concept that it just seems natural, right? If there's bugs out there and other things, let's just turn the chickens out and let them graze. So, oh, fantastic. Other questions or comments folks might have? And we'll see you all next week, 6 o'clock. The best laid plans of mice and men. Have a good night, everyone.